Hello and welcome to Reasoning Through the Bible. Today we're going to take a small break from our normal verse-by-verse Bible studies, which, by the way, Steve and I, we hold that to be the real meat and potatoes of what we do. The real value of our ministry is in a verse-by-verse, careful explanation of the Word of God, and we try to bring in concepts as we go through. But today we're going to take a whole session and do a bit of a rabbit trail. And it is really the historical accuracy of the Bible, and in particularly the New Testament. And we're going to focus a lot on the book of Acts because there's a lot of accuracy there. And so one of the reasons we do this is so that people can know that they can trust their Bibles.
Yeah.
We can trust our Bibles because there's been skeptics and atheists and critics that have attacked the accuracy of the Bible. It is a much attacked book, but it can quite defend itself. Thank you very much. And there's a great deal of corroboration that's done. And we don't really have time here to go through a long, detailed, how do you know things in history. But basically, things in history, you can't determine them by a math formula or doing some sort of a tabletop experiment in a laboratory. You look at clues, and is this clue corroborated by multiple sources? Were the sources valid? Has this source been proven trustworthy in other places? And then you come to reasonable conclusions from that. And that's what we can do with the Bible. And there's enough clues in the Bible to give us a really good, accurate picture of the historicity of the Bible. And we could spend many days on this between things in the Old Testament, things in the New. But we're going to focus on a couple of things. I want to talk about the book of Acts first and talk about, because it is very, very accurate historically. And we have a good bit of historical corroboration. And so bear with me here a little bit as we kind of just go through these. First of all, I'll recommend right up front a couple of books. On a more readable level, there's a book called The Historical Jesus by Gary Habermas, Habermas. Gary Habermas has done quite a bit of work on historical aspects of the New Testament. And The Historical Jesus by Habermas, he goes through and looks at many, I believe I counted, it was up into the 40s of external sources from the first century that corroborate facts inside the New Testament, and specifically the gospel accounts and the epistles. And basically, my memory is it's somewhere between 150 and 250 facts that he recreates from secular history that corroborate things in the Bible. And it's things like there were people running around saying that Jesus Christ rose from the dead and that he died on the cross. And there's a lot more than most people would normally think.
You're talking about historians of that time period you're talking about.
Some of them were historians. Some of them were, like for example, there was at one point a Roman jailer. Some of the strongest evidence are the people that were attacking Christians because they had no reason to try to support Christianity. So the fact they're fighting against it, but their writings corroborate some of the things. Like, for example, at one point there was a jailer that was saying, look, writing a letter to Rome, saying, look, you told us to lock all these people up. And I've locked up all these Christians because they were running around claiming that this guy had risen from the dead. And so now my jail's full. What do you want me to do? And so it's letters like that of people that's saying there's these people running around claiming that this guy that got crucified is now risen alive again. Those are the ones that now we have first century document that would hold that people were claiming these doctrinal things. And it's not somebody trying to build themselves up as an officer of the church. Things like Pontius Pilate's name being chiseled into a stone. I mean, there's things like that. And again, Habermas's book is really good. I'm going to talk about things today that I got from a different book. The Habermas book is really for kind of a lay person that is much more introductory level, but it's really good. There's another book called The Book of Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History by Colin Hemmer, Hemer. The Book of Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History by Hemmer. And that book is really more for a professional historian. It's very dense and rather heavy. It's good bedtime reading, but it's wonderful stuff. Just the bibliography alone is worth the price of the book because he's got all these wonderful sources in there. And he came up with many dozens of things in the Book of Acts that he corroborated historically. And I'll go through a few of these here that we can tell that, and again, these are things that are documented, that Hemmer gives the citations for, and it's things like, if you read through especially the last half of the Book of Acts, you've got all these details. And at first reading, it's like his travelogue. He's saying, okay, we went here and we went to this city and then we walked down to that port and we spoke to these people there and Paul got arrested and then we went on to the next city and we talked to one of the officials there and we got in a boat and we sailed across to this other port. And through all of that, the average Christian's saying, okay, this is boring, tell me about the good stuff, and they skip past it. But to those of us that are really concerned about showing the accuracy of the Bible, this is a gold mine. Yeah. Because he tells things in there. Luke, Dr. Luke, who wrote the book of Luke and Acts, which way the wind blows at certain times of the year, what kind of crops were shipped out of certain ports, and how far it took to sail from one place to the other, the sequence of the towns and the little villages as they're walking on these journeys. He gives the names of the people that were the leaders there. He gives the titles of them. He tells what religion and what idols they were worshiping in which city. He gives distances of things, geographic details, and it just goes on and on and on. And it's just a wonderful treasure trove of historical facts that give people like us, hey, we can conclude from this that there's trustworthiness in our Bibles, and that's why we do these kind of things. For example, he gives there was in Acts 17:6 he uses the word politarch for the city rulers. And that's just a word that wasn't used everywhere. And so that's one of these little facts. Correct location of the cities when you're making a journey from Thyatira to Thessalonica. He gives the correct sequence of the cities there. He talks about how in Acts 17:16 there was all of these statues in Athens. So that was correct. And even reference to there was a synagogue in Athens, which wouldn't have normally been thought in 1717. He gave the correct list of philosophers and what they taught in Acts 17. In Acts 17, there were these two groups of philosophers, the Stoics and the Epicureans. And through Paul's speech against them, we can tell that Paul knew exactly what those different philosophers were debating about. And Paul even quotes some of their poets and gives an accurate quotation from it, which, again, these are all just facts that pile up. He gave in Acts 19, verses 24 and 27, he gave the correct identification of the idol cult that was being worshipped in that town in Ephesus. So he gave the right idol in the right town being worshipped by these people. There was a theater that was the meeting place. And he says they went into this theater and had this big riot. Well, that would have been the normal place they would have gone for a meeting. Was in the theater in Ephesus and not some other building. He gave in 1935, he gives the titles of the people in Ephesus, and those were correct. The correct name to identify the goddess at Ephesus. The use of the plural in Acts 19:38 is the exact reference that particular point in time there were two men who were jointly executing the function of proconsul at that time, and Luke gets it exactly right when he uses a plural, had an S on the end of the word. And again, how are you going to know that if you weren't there in the first century in that town and knew all those details?
Right.
He goes on. When in Acts 20, verse 13, they talk about how it was a safer to go the land route as opposed to the riskier sea route on that particular route. How are you going to know that if you didn't know the geography and knowing how risky it was to sail to those particular points at that point in the year as opposed to going by land? The purification ritual of the Jewish people in 21:24, and he talks about that and what they had to do. So now you have somebody that's not only familiar with all the Gentile religious aspects and the physical geography and the titles of the people and how many of them there were, but now they also know the Jewish purification rituals that had to go on. How many people in the first century were going to have an intimate knowledge of both Judaism and their purification rituals after a vow, and also all these Gentile things?
Right.
You're narrowing down your list of who could have actually produced this and when they could have actually produced it, right? And so again, what kind of crops were being shipped out of which port, and on and on and on. I want to mention one in particular that Hemmer mentions in his book. He talks about a specific thing. If you look at the Acts 27, verses 16 to 19, he's sailing on a ship, and they talk about this island called Cauda in 27:16, and what they had to do in the storm, and what the sailors had to do when they were in this violent storm on the Mediterranean Sea. Well, one of the things he gets right in that whole section is there's a lot of technical nautical terms for the ropes on the ship and the tackle and different things they would do on the ship and how the sailors acted. All that would have been impossible to know unless you really knew sailing terms from the first century on the Mediterranean Sea.
Right.
So that's one. But again, he says in the storm, they sailed past the island of Cauda. And it just goes on with the story. And again, not being a historian, whenever I read it, I just skip over that part.
Right.
Right? Because who cares, right? It's just one little island they sail past.
Right.
But if you're a historian, it gives you information. Because, and what Hemmer does is he says, the accuracy of that account tells us how far this island was from the shore. And there were two currently existing writers from that era that would give some sort of a clue as to where that island is on their maps. So again, here's the preposition. If you were in another land at a later date trying to invent a religious story and call it the Book of Acts,
right,
the only references you would have had were these other two citations of the maps. And of course, today the island's still there. We can go there with accurate modern mapping techniques and tell down to the inch how far the island is.
Right.
And guess who's right? Right. Luke gets it right. And the other people that are, again, the only existing ones we have today from the first century, they get it wrong. And so what Hemmer is saying in this book is that this is so accurate, and it is so many details, and it's so detailed that, and this is the claim that Hemmer makes, and it's quite a strong claim. What he's saying is the burden of proof is on the skeptic.
Yeah.
The burden of proof is on the skeptic to show how could somebody know all of those details, down to the point of how far it takes to sail around the island of Cauda, and which direction the sailors would sail around that island when the wind's blowing from a certain direction on a wooden sailing ship. The burden of proof for that is not on the Christian.
Right.
The burden of proof is on the skeptic to demonstrate how could somebody invent a religious story and come to this much detail.
And that's a trap. Excuse me. That's a trap I think that we fall into as Christians many times, is that we just take a premise that a skeptic throws out there and we go off and do all the research and we do everything to go and prove it, whenever we don't ever ask them up front, well, why are you saying this isn't true? What's your proof as to why it's not true? And I think it is. It's their burden of proof in order to prove it's not true, and then we can go and refute it. But we should at least get well, what's your reasoning behind why you're saying that?
If the Bible was no more nor less than a fuzzy religious book that says be good and worship God, if that's as far as it went, then I would agree with the skeptic. The burden of proof is on us. Yeah. But when we have a book that has hundreds of accurate details that are corroborate with names down to, okay, that particular year in that particular town, there were 2 of them, to that level of detail, then the burden of proof shifts to the skeptic. It's real easy for a skeptic or a critic to wave a hand and say, oh, that's just some religious myth. Right. It's something else entirely to explain these facts. And Hemmer gives the citations. The 2 map makers were Pliny and Ptolemy, and he gives the citations from those 2 works and then shows how Luke got it right. And so this isn't fuzzy pie in the sky, fuzzy religious stuff, be good and worship. Right. No, this is accurate historical details. It includes names of people that had nothing to do with the religious doctrine. I mean, why would anybody care if you're only writing a religious book to try to deceive people? Why would you include all this specific stuff that's so hard to validate? Right.
And I also think it, with Luke's writing, it fits in with, the person that he's writing to, Theophilus. And, there's people that believe that Theophilus commissioned Luke to do this, to write these accounts. It fits in with it because he's writing to somebody. So as he's writing to a specific person, he's giving all these details in regards to the different areas and the different things of a person that was there in the contemporary time frame. Right. So he's not writing, this isn't something that's written 500 years later, as an example, as a historic document that's just kind of broadband. It makes sense to me that he's giving all these details because he's writing at the time contemporary to a specific person that's living in that contemporary time, and it makes sense in order to give him all these different descriptions.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
Of places, people, and things, right? Because that person knows all of those places, persons, and areas as well.
And see, that's the accusation from the atheists. The atheists say, oh, that's just a religious novel. And, okay, they claim, okay, we can write a religious novel that had present-day names of people in it, but as soon as you start talking about God or miracles, then it goes away. Well, it gets more and more difficult to hold that position with this level of detail. Right. And so let me give a quote here from Hemmer. This is on page 333 of Hemmer's book. He says, quote, "The onus is scarcely upon me to prove my point. Rather, it is the objector's task to break the integration which is latent in the narrative and merely brought to the surface in the present discussion," close quote. So what he's claiming there, and again, this is a dense book where he builds this fact up. He says the history is so large, so detailed, and so integrated into the story, and it's written as kind of a second hand into the story. Again, the verse about Cauda is a good example. The inclusion of these details is not forced.
Right.
That's the point that Hemmer's making.
It flows with the story.
It's in the fabric of the story.
Right.
And they weren't trying to include all these details. It just came out.
Yeah.
It flows as a natural somebody that was giving a true travelogue. It wasn't somebody trying to prove something.
Right.
It was just part of the fabric of the story. And that's what makes it even more powerful.
Right.
Now, let me read another. And there's another first century historian by the name of Josephus. And Josephus, not a Christian, he was a secular Jew that was hired by the Roman government to write a history of the Jews. Yep. And he's got a couple of big, thick works that added together, kind of massive.
Yeah.
But history of the Jewish people. And I went through Josephus and came out with, I have a fairly dense book, but I've got, how many of these now? 46 of these. And I'll put all this stuff on our website if anybody wants to see them. Mm-hmm. But I went through Josephus just on my own with just a cursory reading and found a series of things from Josephus that corroborate things in the Bible. Now, if you mention Josephus and the Bible, the critic's going to come up and say, well, there were these two verses that he mentioned specifically Jesus. And there's some argumentation back and forth about whether that was inserted later or whether it was really part of the original Josephus. I submit Habermas's book. He goes into detail on those two quotes and says what we can hold to and what we can't. My list doesn't include those, does not include those. My list says things like Alexander the Great was there and which cities he took over. The temple in Jerusalem had many riches in it. There were golden candlesticks, table of showbread, altar of incense. There was crucifixion was done in that particular country at that particular time. You know, crucifixion wasn't done for a huge long time. It was only really invented by the Romans in a particular window of time.
So this is a depiction of Josephus recounting when Alexander the Great came and took over that area, which Alexander did before the Roman occupation. So what you're saying is that Josephus is documenting what Greek people had noted in the capture of Jerusalem and the temple, the instruments that were there and things like that.
And what Josephus is showing is that when Alexander came in, he lined up perfectly with what Daniel chapter 8 says, right? Because Daniel chapter 8 mentions Alexander.
Right.
And so going on, Josephus mentions that there was animosity between the Jews and the Samaritans. He mentions the Sanhedrin. He mentions the Pharisees and the Sadducees and mentions what they believed and what they didn't. All that lines up with the scriptures, that the Sadducees didn't believe in angels or the afterlife and the Pharisees did. All that is mentioned in the Bible and in Josephus. And that the priests were particular about the exact letter of the law. Josephus mentions that outsiders couldn't go in and watch the ceremonies inside the temple.
Yep.
And here's the one that really drives this home to me. And this is the one that out of all of these caught my eye the best. In Acts, later in the book, it mentions there was a governor Felix that was governor of Judea. That's mentioned in Acts 23. And that in Acts 24, verse 24, it mentioned, remember, those of you that know the story, Paul gets arrested. And he's in jail. And in Acts 24, Felix comes and Paul gets to speak before him. Right? So it mentions, Acts 24:24, Felix came with his wife Drusilla. and Paul got to spoke in front of him. It just mentions Felix and his wife Drusilla.
Right.
The next chapter, Acts 25, we have King Agrippa that comes, and Paul gets to speak in front of Agrippa. Okay, well, that's besides getting accurate people, Felix, Drusilla, Agrippa, these are all accurate historical people that the Bible talks about. But the nuance here that's really powerful is this. Acts 24 says Felix and his wife Drusilla.
Mm-hmm.
Acts 25 says Agrippa and Bernice.
Mm.
I always thought she was a wife too.
Mm.
Acts 25 doesn't say that Agrippa was married to Bernice.
Mm-hmm.
It just says Agrippa and Bernice.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you go over to Josephus, he fills in the rest of the story. Bernice was Agrippa's sister.
Mm.
They weren't married. And so Felix and Drusilla were married.
Right.
Agrippa and Bernice were not.
Mm-hmm.
And so Luke accurately gets the family relationships between these two people. And as a matter of fact, Agrippa was having an incestuous relationship off and on for their entire lives with his sister Bernice. And if all that's in secular history, but Luke, none of that was part of his story, so Luke doesn't go into detail there. He just says, okay, Agrippa and Bernice were there.
Right.
Well, he doesn't call her a wife, even though they acted like husband and wife. They were really sister and brother.
Right.
And so, not part of the story. Luke just, again, that's the kind of thing that is ingrained into the fabric of the story, but not forced.
Right.
And it's one of the many reasons why this is really just a treasure trove of accurate details. He has in here, James, the brother of Christ, is mentioned in Josephus. Mm-hmm. And it's got the correct names for that Caesarea Philippi was kind of a unique name. There were more than one Caesareas.
Right. And
both the Bible and Josephus bring that out. Mm-hmm. And it just goes on and on. The correct doctrinal position of the Sadducees and the Pharisees, we mentioned that. Herod killed John the Baptist. That's in Josephus and in the Bible.
Right.
So now we've got all of this corroboration. Mm-hmm. We've got a long line of hundreds of facts that are corroborated by multiple sources outside the Bible. Josephus, and the Hemmer book gives hundreds of sources. Habermas has another 3.5 sources, some of which were fighting against Christianity, which were the most powerful ones. And from all that, we corroborate a giant pile of factual sources about geography, about people, about places, about what people did, the relationships between all these people, and it's spookily accurate. Therefore, it only makes sense that the things that we can't historically corroborate, like what Paul said to people in private,
right?
There's no way to historically corroborate that in Josephus because only a couple of people were there.
Right.
Or the fact that Peter did a miracle, that's not going to be corroborated. And that would never have been corroborated in Josephus or any of these other things. But we have, again, in Habermas' book, they were claiming people went around and did miracles. And so there's so much corroboration that's so strong and so good. The conclusion is we can trust our Bibles. And the burden of proof is not on us. The burden of proof is on the atheist, the skeptic, and the critic. Because we've given a hugely accurate, hugely long, very accurate list of historical details. It's so much that it just gets tedious. And Luke knew exactly what he was doing in some of the cases, because in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 3, he gives a whole series of 15th year of Caesar and on and on and on. So he places it down to the year and who was the procurator, things like that. I'll give you one more, and this is another one that's really powerful. In Luke, he talks about a census.
Yeah.
And our atheist and skeptic friends are always really big to try, there wasn't a census then. Really? we happen to have historical confirmation that there were very similar censuses that were done in that day by the Roman government that made people go to their ancestral homes. Now that's documented history. Okay. The other one that comes out with that is they say, oh, well, it talks about the person being the governor. Remember, what was his name? That was the governor in Luke 2? Was governor at that time?
Sylvanus? Sylvanus, is that right? Luke 2. Caesar Augustus.
No. Pause one moment. Caesar Augustus Quirinius. The Luke 2:2. This was the first census taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria.
Yeah. Now,
our critics point out, oh, well, this would have happened at a time while Quirinius was not governor. Okay? And so therefore we can't trust the Bible. Now, what the original Greek actually says, and I've corroborated this, in the text, what it says in Luke 2 is this was the first census while Quirinius was governing Syria. It does not say while Quirinius was governor, the way many of our English translations say. It says governing. Why is that important? Because Quirinius, according to secular history, was a military leader. And he was in a military campaign through the land of Canaan and the land of Israel. And he had taken his forces and had pushed through. And there was a period of time there where he was the military leader
governing the area.
Governing the area over martial law. At that point, in the midst of this military campaign, which lasted a while. This wasn't like a 1 week, 1 month thing. This took years.
Right.
And so there was a period there where he was governing through martial law. Then the actual governor of the region died. They pull Quirinius back to Rome, anoint him as governor. He comes back as governor. And so there was 2 periods where he was governing. Luke, again, in the fabric of the story, gives us a clue. It wasn't when he was governor. It was in the military campaigns prior to that when he was governing.
Right.
And so we can indeed trust our Bibles. It is just spookily good with all of the accurate details that it gives. And I would just submit those sources that we already talked about. And in the end, just read it in English. You can tell how good it is.
And what you've quoted here is historical. That doesn't even go into the archaeological finds that they've made through the years of actual places. I know here in the last 30, 40, 50 years or so, they've located Joshua's altar on Mount Ebal.
They located Joshua's altar.
Yeah.
And they found a small lead tablet that has early Hebrew writing on it that has a curse and uses God's name.
Yahweh.
Which places what? Tell the significance of that.
It's the earliest accounting of Yahweh, the mention of the God Yahweh, number one. Number two is when they did this excavation, they found all of the animal bones that they found were all kosher animals. So that's a proof that it was a Jewish or an Israelite altar that was there. And so this goes and corroborates in Joshua when it talks about him building an altar there on Mount Ebal, that now they have the actual altar that they found. And this is just one of hundreds of different archaeologists. They found Jericho and excavated it, and on and on and on and on. So
they found the actual bones of the high priest.
Yeah, Caiaphas.
That they dug those up a few years back.
Ossuary, yep.
And they reburied the skeleton, but out of respect. But they still have the bone box, and they're very confident it's his.
Right.
And it just goes on and on. Again, Pontius Pilate's name chiseled into a stone. They have King David's name that they found in writing, and it just goes on and on and on. And so we can indeed trust our Bibles.
Right.
And so that's the conclusion. Again, we could keep going like this for a long time. I would just submit our readers those sources that we already talked about. And our notes here we'll have on our website.
Right. So
we hope you like that. If you have any questions about any of that or any questions about other things, submit them to us at info at reasoningthroughthebible.com. And we trust that you will follow along with us as we reason through the Bible.